Okay, I'll do a little reading here from Ernst Von Solomon's The Outlaws. Ernst Von Solomon was one of those conservative revolution dudes. He was in the Freikorps, and then he became a writer afterwards. And he was sort of his own right-wing kind of dude. He wasn't really part of any group, but he became like a screenwriter. And after the war, he was brutalized along with his Jewish wife by American soldiers. Okay, and of course, years later, he wrote some more stuff, and his stuff's been translated. I believe his son is actually in the German film industry, whatever, I don't know how much of an industry they have, but very interesting man. This book, I'm almost done with it. Lots of it shows you the crazy situation right after the World War and in Germany, and all the stuff in the borders with Poland and Bolshevism and the kind of different thoughts, the ideological spectrums that you had, and the nationalism. Okay, I keep saying in a lot of ways I'm still very left-wing in how I look at things, and there's a degree of revolutionary spirit in this. And by the way, that is a captured Russian armored car, of many which the Germans had, which were not too good. I mean, you couldn't use them on the Western Front because there was no roads. But in city fighting after the war with the Reds and Polish nationalists and whatnot, they became very effective. And you got the skull and crossbones on there. Very cool thing. Very cool stuff. Anyway, I'm going to do a little reading from this. The backdrop is that Ernst and his comrades had to surrender to a bunch of Reds, and I forgot what city, and basically them, being forced to walk out in humiliation through a crowd of people, but only after the officers are going to be executed. A very French Revolution. And here we have, I'll start reading. The beast in the Russian blouse was talking to a gigantic workman who was armed and wearing an enormous red brassard. This fellow's coat was open, and his bare brown chest was adorned with blue and red tattooings. The noise outside increased. He heard shrill yells from the women. Stones crashed on the door. The fellow in the Russian blouse turned to us and said, "We know there are still some officers amongst you. You're fools to allow yourself to be misled by these swine. If any of you will tell us which of the officers is still among you, we'll let you off and send you to Hamburg on this safe escort and set you free there. But if you don't give us up your officers, just you wait and see what happens." Well, what about it? I immediately seized Wuth's arm with my left hand and held tight. I felt his muscles stiffening, a shiver go over his whole body. I held on as hard as I could and kept him back. He was striving with all his might to get forward. His idea was, of course, to give himself up for our sakes. Obviously, he could not be allowed to do so. He struggled to loosen my grip. I glared at him furiously. He had a drawn look. His skin seemed to be pulled tight over his thin cheeks, but his mouth was set firmly. "Keep your jaw shut, Wuth," I whispered. The rest of the prisoners stood without making sound or movement. On the right flank, a slight disturbance occurred. I looked round anxiously. It was only Tichy, one of the Hamburgers, who had put his hand on the back of a chair, playfully and apparently unconcernedly. "Very well, have it your own way," said the man in the Russian blouse. The other fellow turned sharply round, stamped his cudgel violently on the floor, and went out. The first said, "You're going to be moved from here, but not for a little while yet. There aren't quite enough people waiting for you outside at present." He grinned and left us. The prisoners instantly crowded around Wuth. Teacher said, "What on earth do the comrades take us for?" and waved his chair. Wuth snarled through his teeth. "If these people out there make themselves unpleasant, gentlemen, hit back. Don't submit to anything. Take care always to keep next to one of the guards or behind him so that he gets his share from his own people. Keep close together. The biggest men go in front and at the back. Wounded men in the middle. Snatch their sticks from them when you can, but don't get out of line. Keep your eyes on me. I shall be in the front rank." After a short pause, he inquired, "How many Hamburgers are actually left?" Somebody answered, 12. We said no more. The tattooed man entered and roared, "Fall in!" and then threw open the door. For a few moments there was no sound except the tramp of our feet. Wuth was the first to emerge. I followed close behind him. We ran, ducking our heads and raising our arms to ward off blows. The crowd made way at once, as though a wedge had been driven into them. We did not know which way we were to go. We did not know whether we had been delivered over to the crowd or whether there was some place of refuge for us. All we knew was that we had got to put up a decent show, even if it was our last. A whirl of stumbling feet was before my eyes, and my left fist smashed into a face and felt the scrunch of something cartilaginous. A heavy blow came down on my head, its force broken by my arm. A corduroy-covered stomach came into my line of vision and collapsed after a well-aimed kick. A hard black hat fell, and I got a tremendous, if unreasonable, satisfaction out of stamping on it. Something hit me on the head. Something hammered my shoulder till it was sore. There was a shin. I landed one on it with my heavy boot. A blow fell on my right arm, which was hideously painful. This was an unfair game. Each of the opponents was only hit once, but we were struck times without number. The tattooed fellow was marching beside me. He held his gun half up, but he was looking carelessly ahead and allowed anyone to strike us who could. I saw a laborer swinging a long hose like a cowboy with a lasso. I leapt back. The hose fell with a whack and wound itself noisily around the tattooed guard. He howled with rage, turned round and drove the butt of his rifle into the laborer's face. Wuth was 3 paces away from me, boxing scientifically. Some women got at him. These women hammered us with sticks, stones, pots, and ropes. They were broadly built and wearing dresses made of some kind of blue stuff with wet aprons and dirty skirts. Their wrinkled faces red with exertion, their hair tangled and wild. They spat, abused us, screamed. We reached them, now to get past them. A little Bavarian, an elderly man, was next to me, panting with running, and when we got near the women, I heard one screech, "What are you hitting the young ones for? Get at the old goats and swipe them." The unfortunate little Bavarian got his share. In a narrow street through which we passed was a strong lad who took his job very seriously. He picked his men and looked searchingly and carefully along the line before striking. But then he delivered an uppercut that sent the victim reeling and covered him with blood from nose to jaw. He lighted on Wuth, which was a mistake, for Wuth ducked with lightning speed. The brute stumbled, and Wuth ran his knee into him, below the belt with all his force. He doubled up and fell, but Wuth fell with him, and they rolled over each other. I got to the spot, seized Wuth by the collar, and dragged him up. We raced on. I no longer felt pain in my arm. I began lashing out even when no one was threatening me. Shots resounded at the back. There were screams, and the crowd got restless. However, a fresh gang came out of a side street, chiefly composed of women. The women were the worst. Men hit, but women spit and abuse, and it is impossible to plant one's fist in their faces. All at once I saw, an ideal amid this confusion, an old woman leaning on her umbrella. She had such dear old eyes under her bugle cap. She could hardly stand. She looked at us earnestly and lifted her umbrella in her trembling hand and hit me with it. Christ! More shots. Now we ran for all we were worth, driven by shouts and blows, the mob in our wake. We came to a high red wall. A gate flew open. We sped through it. We had arrived in the pioneers' barracks. The Reds collected at the gate and barred the way to the crowd. We stood panting, wounded and bleeding in the yard. The Reichswehr men showed us the way and hurried us indoors. We were taken to a riding school whose floor was thickly covered with peas straw. 7 of us had been shot and killed by the mob. Wuth lying on the floor of the riding school snarled, "Next time we come to this bitchy town, by God, we'll bring 15-centimeter guns." However, Tiche, the incorrigible, averred, "Scrap is always good fun, even if you get hit yourself." We lay in the riding school for 3 days in the rustling, dusty straw, irritated, tired, exhausted, filled with a dull, gnawing rage. One of the Bavarians told us each day in a monotonous voice how Berthold had died. This man had been with the captain to the end. Berthold had gotten to the side street under cover of the cloak. Then he met a group of sailors and workmen. One of them recognized him by his Pour le Marie. They attacked him. He defended himself and lashed out in all directions. A stick hit him on his bare head, and he sank to the ground. He managed to draw his sword, which he still wore, but it was seized from him. He fought for his decoration, half leaning against a lamppost. He was dragged down. His legs were trampled on. His tunic was pulled off. His wounded arm was broken. Berthold snatched a revolver from one of the sailors and shot him down. They flung themselves upon him. A knife flashed. His throat was cut. Slowly he gasped out his life, alone, fighting to the last, trampled in the filth of the gutter. His murderers divided his money amongst them. The Bavarian lay on a doorstep, wounded and under guard. One of the sentries from the train told us how they had been attacked and cut up. Very few were still alive. The baggage had been stolen. One of the Reichswehr pioneers told us what tremendous losses we had inflicted on the Harburg men. We told him what we thought of his corps, and he retired offended. But the sergeant major, who was our chief warder, told us we had malicious pleasure that the Berlin putsch had failed. We listened to him in astonishment. Then teacher said, yes, quite true, we had an idea of making a putsch. Well, it's all gone foot and caps bust. Here we turned our backs on the noble pioneer and crept into our straw. Nobody knew what was to be our fate. We sat there and waited and had plenty of time for reflection. The captain's sister came and brought us cigarettes. The Bavarians surrounded her, their faces twitching, unable to say a word. She was quiet and brave. Nobody spoke a word in the writing school on the evening after her visit. On the third evening, I said to Ruth, the longer I think about it, the more I am convinced that our war isn't over yet. But I also know that up to now, our attempts were bound to miscarry. We shall never be a company again. Each one of us will have to fight his own battles from now on. What are you going to do, Wolf? And that's a reading of it, where these young men become fighting the communists and fighting nationalists of other countries like the newly resurgent Poland. They start forming little groups of their own. And it's very interesting to look at it. They talk about the November Revolution, that the bourgeoisie are still in power. The communists, some of them are actually, some of them are misguided. Of course, some of them are doing the bidding of the bourgeoisie. But these men become very revolutionary, and Ernst Von Solomon himself joined the group, and he actually had a hand in the assassination of a Weimar politician, of which he did time in prison. Very interesting history. Of course, we all know that these kind of men are pretty much gone now. And it's just an interesting snapshot in time of when the world was changing. Only as a historical document, pretty much. Obviously, what we face in the future, we don't have any of this. Except that the only advice here, alright, is here. We shall never be a company again. Each one of us will have to fight his own battles from now on. And the way you fight is to make a life, to make your own world, and throw something into the future. The actual battles like this are pretty much over. Alright, later.